All right, everyone, we want to welcome you to today's coffee chat with the Quincy College faculty. Today's conversation is a continuation of a previous conversation we had on rubrics. We're going to continue the conversation today talking a little bit more about the critical components of quality rubrics, and we're going to bring that conversation forward to talk about how we can use rubrics to really foster self-directed learning in both our online and on-campus classrooms, putting them in the driver's seat. And to start off, we want to talk a little bit about our format. I, along with Melody Liu, are the facilitators for our coffee chats. You are the participants, and you are the most important part of our coffee chat. You'll be able to communicate freely via the chat feature. We do ask that microphones stay muted until you're ready to speak, or if you have a question, you can just unmute and fire away at the questions and talk talk with each other amongst the whole group, because we are, in addition to working together in Zoom, we are a community of practice, and that means that we welcome a fluid conversation with equal voice, so we want to be aware of our individual airtime as well. And we are mutually responsible for each other's learning, and that means that we share experiences, we ask questions of each other, so that together, not only individually but together, we can have a deeper understanding of whatever the topic may be, whatever the interest may be. So that brings us to today. So today's conversation, as I mentioned, is really digging a little bit deeper into those elements of the essential components of high quality rubrics. We're going to review some of the basic types of rubrics. I'm going to share some examples for you to consider use again in your online and on-campus classrooms. And I really want us to dig in a little bit deeper today about how we can use these rubrics to help students self-monitor, self-assess, and self-adjust their own work. That's the whole self-directed learning approach that we do foster here at Quincy College. And Melody is actually going to take a little bit of time to talk to you about how you can create varied rubrics in Canvas. She's going to take you on a little bit of a tutorial today. So let's get started. We have a lot to talk about. I wanted to throw out a couple of guiding questions to really frame the learning today. The first guided question has us thinking about helping students identify when they have actually learned the content and mastered the skills throughout the course. That's the whole metacognitive piece that we really want to always bring to light when we're having conversations with students and when we're building our courses, again, whether online or on campus. And we also want to keep in mind how we can use rubrics to help students identify when they have not learned the content and the skills mastered throughout the course. Again, this is all about putting the students in the forefront and really giving them the tools to help direct their own learning in our classrooms. Okay, so that brings us to self-directed learning. And there are several different ways to look at self-directed learning. For the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to focus on self-directed learning as it pertains to our instructional processes. So when we put the process in place for students, so if you think of that online course design or activities that you create throughout your course on campus, that's the instructional process. And we want, in terms of a self-directed approach, we want our students to be able to navigate through the course, through the activities on their own. And that leads us also to that self-management piece and the self-monitoring piece. Management has to do with when we want our students to block out a bit of time to focus on an activity, to focus on their own homework. They have to have the understanding, well, this is going to take me so much time, therefore I really should block out this much time. And that self-monitoring piece, you can see it's moved out a little bit because today is really targeting more so that piece. The question remains for students, how do I as a student self-monitor? How do I really know whether I'm understanding, whether I'm not understanding, and what do I do depending on where I land? So when we look at rubrics, we can think of the rubric, and I have mentioned this before, we think of the rubric as that roadmap. We as the teachers know where the students are headed, right? We know where they need to be in the middle of the course, where they need to be at the end of the course. And because of that, we set up the structure of the course, beginning, middle, and end, to help the students have a successful journey throughout. Rubrics have a crucial role in that whole piece. Rubrics are literally the map for students to determine where they are at in between this part of the journey and this part of the journey and this part of the journey, leading to the successful completion of the course. And so when we take a deeper look at the different types of rubrics, we can then identify this this map approach, this tool for guidance and instruction, and looking at both formative types of rubrics and summative types of rubrics also help us to determine when we should use a rubric and how should that rubric literally look like. So therefore, we can use rubrics for tools for instruction and for guidance. The last time we had a conversation about rubrics, we looked at two overarching types. This is just a real quick review for everybody. We know that we have those holistic rubrics, which are really the rubrics that take a look at those bigger, more enduring outcomes, and I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. And then we have that analytical rubric that allows us to really dig in a little bit deeper into those critical components of any of the activities that students need to complete throughout the course. So this is a holistic rubric example that I've shared with you before. This goes back to the Great American Chocolate Chip Cookie Test when we spoke last time during part 1. You see here that we have, it's holistic, it's a basic rubric. It has 2 possible indicators for success, and they're broad. So the first one, bake chocolate chip cookies with quality ingredients at the optimal temperature and time. That's a very broad statement when it comes to making chocolate chip cookies and then displaying the chocolate chip cookies. So here we see again in this rubric example that we're looking at 2 overarching broader components that really do qualify a student's product at the end of the course or an assignment. The analytical rubric example that you can see here again with the Great American Chocolate Chip Cookie Test, that allows us to dig a little bit deeper into those critical elements of a chocolate chip cookie. So again, you see here that analytical piece that allows us to focus on the chocolate chips, the shape and size, and the texture. So now we have 2 different overarching types of rubrics that we can consider. The question remains, however, when you're creating an analytical rubric, let's say, how do we go about doing that? How do we know that we're creating the rubric the right way? So we're looking at the top here, we're seeing that we have our critical elements. Advance again, Melody, on the left-hand side. Thank you. At the top, we're seeing the different proficiency levels, and those are the descriptors. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those descriptors in a moment. But at the top, you're seeing that you have descriptors that really do describe the different proficiency levels for those critical elements. For this type of analytical rubric, we're seeing proficient, exemplary, needs improvement, and not evident. And what those 2 arrows are showing you is that when you're looking at yes, there it is. It's that right in the center. That allows you to focus in. So for shape and size and proficiency level, we're zooming right into that descriptor. And that brings us to the strike zone. So when you're creating your rubrics, you're really looking at, and I brought up the strike zone because, of course, baseball season is coming. top of the shoulders to just below the kneecap. That's the strike zone. So the pitcher wants to throw the ball in that strike zone area, right? So that's the same idea when we're targeting for those analytical rubrics. We want to always be looking for the strike zone for our students. Go ahead. So what does that mean in terms of how we actually write those critical elements out? So here's an example. Here's an example that I pulled from a rubric that it's an English rubric, English comp rubric. And I just pulled out one critical element. The critical element here is listed as the introduction, the argument, and the idea. And we're focusing on how the rubric descriptors help us qualify the critical element and how the descriptors are different across those 4 proficiency levels. There needs to be a very smooth slide going back and forth. So we see here the shades of green example. And I like using this example because in my mind, this is the best way to think about each critical element and those proficiency descriptors. So for example, if we look at proficient, and remember we talked about that strike zone, notice how proficient is a shade of green, and the actual the width of that shade of green is relatively small. That's the strike zone. And the reason why we're calling proficient the strike zone is because all students, at the very least, must hit that strike zone. We want all of our students to be proficient, right? So when we're looking at this critical element at proficient, we see that the students, in order to be proficient for this critical element, they discuss the main argument or idea about the relationship between selected works and the chosen theme. That's the strike zone. And in order for that student to hit that, they must be right in the center there. Now you notice to the left, when you're looking at exemplary, the shade of green is a little brighter and it's longer. Why? Because, take a look at the descriptor. The student meets all of those proficient criteria and makes especially clear connections between the main argument or idea and the selected works and chosen theme. So that represents a wider variety of ways that students can make especially clear connections. There are a variety of ways. For proficient, again, they have to at least discuss the main idea about the relationship. For exemplary, well, they need to be especially clear. Now, if you go back to needs improvement and not evident, we notice again we have a wider range, a darker shade of green, but a wider range because, again, students, there are a variety of ways that students can miss that mark. And then, of course, not evident is not evident. But again, I ask everyone to go back to that strike zone idea. You get the mark right in the middle, and that's proficient. If you go above and beyond that, well, you're exemplary. And there are a lot of different ways that you can show you're exemplary, above and beyond that mark. If you miss the mark, well, there are probably several ways that you can miss the mark. And then, of course, not evident is not evident. So this is just one example of how you can actually write out a critical element in terms of those analytical proficiency descriptors. And I want to point out the wording. Notice how when you go to the left or to the right, that the wording is consistent. The student discusses the main idea. You go to the left, they've already hit that discussion, they've hit the main idea, but they've made especially clear connections between the main idea, the selected works, and the chosen theme. And then, of course, you go to the left and you see the same connection between those key elements. So now I bring us back. I want to open up for questions. You feel free to ask any questions that you want at this point about how to craft that critical element or the difference between holistic and analytical, whatever the case may be. And I just want to point out again the guiding questions, and imagine handing the students some rubrics, whether they're holistic or analytical, and allowing them to use those rubrics as a tool to self-monitor, to self-assess, and self-adjust their own work. And I put these guiding questions up here again, just again to focus our thinking. So feel free to unmute, ask questions of each other, and share ideas. Anyone?
Lisa, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't necessarily see everybody, but go ahead.
That's okay. Mark Lanane. Speed grader, we apply numbers.
Yeah.
So should we really be using what you're discussing at the beginning of the course as a way, to show exemplary and proficient will get you this level of mark? Is that what we're trying to get at today, or did you want to use that in the speed grading during the course?
Well, the numbering or the parceling out of points, if you will, for each of those critical elements, whether it's the proficiency level back and forth, that's up to you. I don't, as an educator myself, I don't on my rubrics, when I hand them to students, I don't put the marking at all. I would rather them focus on the content, what's written, rather than the points. I find in the past, and I'm anxious to hear what someone else thinks, but I find in the past when I put too much of the percentage of the point value out there, there's a hypersensitivity or hyper focus on that. But an argument can also be said that why would we even share with students anything other than exemplary or anything other than proficient? And therefore, just like you're creating a single point rubric right down where, if you will, Melody, can you go back to the analytical rubric example? Yeah, you can stop there. So, for example, if this was just picture a full rubric with 10 or 12 critical elements, and if you're a student and you're looking at this and you're thinking, well, gee, maybe I should go for needs improvement. Well, why would you do that, right? So as an educator, a lot of us think, well, we really want our students to be at the very least proficient and, of course, exemplary. So why wouldn't we just give them those two columns and forget about the needs improvement and the not evident? And, again, I welcome the conversation about that. I think it depends on your practice and your experience and your students.
I would jump in on that.
Yeah.
Mark, I think if you had an essay question that you asked this Zoom room right now, and then we went back and looked at how people answered, some of us, if you said, what is X or whatever, some of us would give you 10 examples or 10 pieces of an answer. And others of us would give you 5 pieces of an answer. And others of us would give you 3 pieces of, why are cops, what's going on with Black Lives Matter, right? Somebody would say 1 thing, somebody would say 3 things, somebody would say 5 things. And we would ask ourselves, well, what is a great answer? And a great answer would be someone who gave you 10 things. A good answer is somebody who gave you 5 things, and a barely got their answer is somebody who gave you 1 reason, right? 1 answer to that question. The problem is, for me, in these rubrics is, if you ask Jason what is a great answer to an essay question, I'll say, oh, it comes at it from 5 different angles. And I know my colleague there, Sue Tebow, would say the same thing, right? They get it from 5 different ways, right? Mm-hmm. The social, the economic, the racial, the gender, whatever. And if you ask a student what is a great answer to an essay question, they will tell you the most short, succinct, get me to the end answer that I can possibly give you, which is, you asked me this, you asked me X, I gave you Y. Those are the points. Have a nice day. Give me my points, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I was going to, actually, this kind of relates back. So, Lisa, I was going to ask you about this. When you say student provided an exemplary answer, that is a subjective review of their answer. And I have found that I need to say, in those brackets from dark green to light green, I need to say, student gave an exemplary answer that has at least 5 different angles. And then the proficient one is student gave an answer, a proficient example that has at least 3 different angles, angles of attack. And student gave a not adequate answer that only had 1 angle of attack, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that way I try to eliminate the subjectivity of what is great versus what is good, because the teacher and the student are going to have 2 different opinions about that. But it also then tells the student, if I want to get the 10 points, I got to put 5 things in here. If I'm satisfied with 8 points, I can stop at 3 things. They can do whatever they want to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that, breaking it up to that level of specificity? And I don't know, Mark, if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, well, Jason, that's a valid point and a great question. Again, this goes back to a lot of the philosophy of the use of rubrics, right? Some people will argue that if you limit the descriptor to a number of items, that you are limiting the student's ability to dig in deeper into the content. So, for example, if you list 5 elements, or 5 key points, then you hit proficient. If you list 15 key points, then you're exemplary. Well, that qualifies an amount. Doesn't necessarily qualify a depth of knowledge or a deeper understanding. That's one way of looking at the number, the fleshing out of the numbers, right? But the other piece, and I want to go back to something that you talked about where it's subjective, right? Grading by nature is subjective. It's subjective. I mean, it is what it is, right? When we use, as educators, when we use a rubric, for example, like a rubric that would be built out from this example here, right? We're doing a couple of things. First of all, we're communicating to the students exactly what it is they need to know and be able to do. And we're also holding ourselves at a level of an inter-rater reliability. So, for example, if I'm not using a rubric, let's say, and I'm grading my students' essays tonight and tomorrow night, there's no guarantee that the student, I'll be looking at those student examples tonight at the same level that I'll look at them tomorrow night. For example, I might be really tired tonight. It's Fridays. Fridays are typically really, I'm tired. It's not, but I don't have a choice. I have to correct tonight. So it's probably not going to be a lot of great feedback. Tomorrow night, well, I might have a little more energy, but I might be grumpy tomorrow. So, oh well. So when we use a rubric, when we bring the rubric back into place, and tonight I'm grading, and I'm looking at the rubric right next to the student sample, I'm doing a couple of things. I'm making sure that all of my students are evaluated based on that rubric and not each other. And B, that every time I go to grade, I go to score some of my assessments or my essays, I'm always going to be grading them consistently because I'm using the same consistent document. So that's just a little bit. And, again, some people would argue, well, you know what? I like telling my students, look, exemplary, you have to have at least 5 different ideas. Proficient, it's 2. Some people like that, and they find they've had great success with that. Others have not. I hope that helps.
I think, if I may jump in, I would really appreciate generic verbiage of the rubric, and here's why. Depending on the questions and depending on the assignments, I would either want them to list very specific points or to be very generic. So, for example, if I say list 7 components of human security, it's just that. There won't be anything beyond. So I think the way, or when I say discuss realism and liberalism, right? There may be many aspects of that. So what I do to avoid kind of the situation, kind of find a loophole, I would add in my discussion questions or in my assignments, approach the subject from multiple perspectives, or bring at least this one. And then, of course, I can have a generic rubric, which kind of a bumper sticker thing, like a boilerplate thing, which I can put it in any discussion, in any assignment. So that does not confine me to say, well, there's a multiple perspective, but what if the question has only one or two?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or on the other hand, it does not, as you say, Lisa, does not limit them to those one or two perspectives, and it goes well beyond that.
Yeah, yeah, and there is something to be said for creating those generic rubrics that you can use multiple times, right? And I'm actually going to put out some templates that everybody can just grab and go. And you can go ahead and, and then you can go ahead and use them and just fill them in. I do want to take a few moments to just share a couple of ideas with you on how you can use various types of rubrics to help students with self-monitoring, self-assessing, and self-adjustment. And then Melody's going to show you a couple of tricks on how you can embed rubrics easily into Canvas. This here is from Doug Reeves. This is an example of the kind of rubric that's a little more overarching, right? So we see here that we have the critical elements over on the left side, and then in the middle we see the student's approach to self-assessment as it pertains to that critical element. Now you would imagine that the critical element, political, legal environment, and then sociocultural environment, there's a description, right, for the student to consider. So the student would take your description, right? The student would then compare his or her own work to that critical element. They give this to you, they send this in to you, and then the faculty response, you then give that specific feedback to the student. And so we would see you provide the rubric in an assignment. They self-assess. They tell you where they think they're at in meeting those critical elements. You take a look at the work and you give them your feedback as it pertains to their self-assessment. Melody, can you go on to the next one? This one here is another type of critical element, again, that really brings students at the forefront of their own learning. This one here focuses on the student thinking, the student assessment to meeting those objectives. You could have a course level objective here, or you could have a module level objective. So imagine your objectives on the left-hand side. And the student has gone through several modules, let's say, and there's sort of a portfolio mentality here, right? So the student collects samples of their work showing that they have met or have come closer to meeting those objectives. So they're the objectives, they attach the student pieces, their evidence to the objective, and then they give you their reflection of where they're at in meeting that objective. That's a great way for you to formatively assess them, and it's a really good way for students to, in the moment, metacognitively think about their own progress in meeting those objectives. And the last one, Melody? This one here is one of my favorites, and I think Megan Germanauer will like this a lot. I shared this a little bit with Megan earlier on in the semester. This one is really about putting students in the hot seat, right? So it's a student work analysis model, which means that essentially students work in small groups, and they are working with an anonymous piece of student work. So you either would write this yourself, or you would get permission from another student to use the work anonymously. And you give the students, along with the sample, you give them each that rubric. And the students in smaller groups score that piece of work together. And they come up with their rationale, they come up with, obviously the score, they can come up with the rationale, and then they come up with those areas of improvement. So their recommendations for improvement. This is really helpful in courses that have more of a writing piece as well, or a mathematical piece, where you've got to problem solve, you've got to solve something, you've got to work through something. And I've used it many, many, many times with a lot of success, both online and on campus. And so those are just a couple of examples of rubrics. And again, I'm going to put all of this in our Canvas site. You'll be able to grab and go and use it and adjust. And I'll put that in addition to other bits of research that I've gathered for you today. And now I'm going to quickly turn it over to Melody, who can talk a little bit about using Canvas to create those rubrics.
Yeah, so as you know that if you have already developed the rubric from a Word document you draft on your own, you can easily transfer those rubric to Canvas system. So the workflow for this, I always recommend is that you create the rubric first, like through the rubric tab, and then you add each individual rubric to assignment, because in this way you can customize a rubric to be applied to different assignments. So you actually need to go to the rubric tab from any of your Canvas course. And from here, you can click on add a rubric. And you can just copy paste what you have from your like Word document or PDF. And you can give the name each criteria. Give a title. It's recommended to add long description. And then you're going to determine how many like rating scale you want to give. And you can add as many you want to add another scale. You can give it like a meet expectation. So if you want to add more, you can just click on the plus icon. And you're going to add another new criteria if you have multiple ones. So you can do the same, but the easy way, if you have the exactly the same rating system for different criteria, the easiest way is just duplicate it. So I'm going to duplicate this one and then just change the title. When you finish, you can just click on Create Rubric. So this rubric has already been created. You can reuse the rubric, and when you teach in a different course, you can import this rubric to another course. So the next step is for you to go to individual assignment and click on this assignment. And you're going to click on Add Rubric. So if you want to start from scratch, you can definitely create a totally new rubric. But if you want to use a rubric you already created in this course, you can just click on Find a Rubric button here. And first, you need to select the correct course and select the rubric and click on Use this rubric. So this rubric has been attached. Yeah. And if you go to the Speed Grader, you want to grade your students' work, you can just click on View Rubric button. The rubric will display at one side, and you keep reading the student's response, and you can just grade.
Oh.
Yeah, and then there give you an option. You can just add some comments in regards of these criteria specifically. So this is optional. I mean, if you want to provide additional, like provide individual feedback just for this category, you can add your comments here and here. Yeah, after you finish grading based on this rubric, you can save it and you can give a general comments. So that's the way you create the rubric inside of the Canvas and how to use the rubric to grade your students' work. We have the Canvas instructor has very great written documentation. I will send over the resources to you by the in the follow-up emails. And if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out to us.
We want to thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure. We have more coming your way. The next session is going to focus on student feedback. So we want to thank you, and we hope you'll join us again. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.